Good afternoon, it's Tuesday the 3rd of July 2018, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. Your host today, Mike Robinson, and myself, Brian Gerrish. Theresa.
Yeah, Treason May was giving a briefing or a report to the House of Commons yesterday, talking about the European Council meeting last week. Well, what does she have to say? We've seen over recent weeks and months that Russia and other hostile state actors and non-state actors are trying to sow disunity, destabilize our democracies and test our resolve. So she got straight into the attack on Russia. She said that she thanked our European partners for solidarity in the wake of the appalling nerve agent attack in Salisbury. So they're sticking with this narrative no matter what. And she said that since March, the UK had led work with European partners to propose a package of measures to step up strategic communications against online disinformation. She was talking about cybersecurity threats, hostile intelligence activities. And she said that the Council had agreed an action plan by December, which will go even further in coordinating a pan-European response to the challenge of disinformation. And she went on to say that they had reached agreement in supporting Boris Johnson's efforts to enable the Organisation for Prohibition of Chemical Weapons to attribute responsibility for chemical weapons use. We'll come on to that in a second. And she agreed a new EU sanctions regime against Russia, probably Syria as well. And then she went back onto the issue of terrorist content online. She said that President Macron and her had agreed together for pushing for further action to tackle illegal content, especially terrorist content online. And finally, she said that they were looking ahead to the NATO summit next week. Now, this is the section on defence that she was talking about. Her briefing to the Commons also discussed other matters, which we'll come on to in a second. But getting back to this OPCW business, we mentioned that on Friday last week, but the Russians are continuing to express their concern over this. So here's Georgy Kalamanov, the Russian Deputy Trade Minister, who's also the representative to the OPCW, and saying, as you can see, neither the CSP or the Executive Council of the OPCW nor the Technical Secretariat has a mandate for attributing responsibility for chemical weapons convention violations. The Russians absolutely sticking to their position that the treaty, the Chemical Weapons Convention, does not give the OPCW the power to attribute responsibility for anything. And there are other forums for that. It's not the OPCW's responsibility. And in fact, it would have required a complete renegotiation of the treaty and the convention in order to give them that power. Yeah. So the Russians determined that what Britain has done here was in breach of international law. And I think I have to agree with that.
Well, we see it time and time again, Mike, don't we? The British government needs organisations to give its line, BBC being a classic example. So I don't see why OPCW shouldn't be changed as well.
Well, indeed. Interesting article here in Haaretz. The headline is "Revealed British Air Force bombed pro-Assad forces. Lost major cargo plane." Now, the bombing took place about a month ago and resulted in a number of deaths. One Syrian army officer and 7 others injured. Sorry, 1 death and several injuries. So the RAF targeted pro-Assad forces apparently in the desert between Jordan, Syria and Iraq. Now, the Haaretz is quoting the Sunday Times here, saying that the attack, as I say, took place a month ago when a Typhoon jet dropped a 500-pound Paveway 4 bomb on pro-Assad forces in a firefight near a British and American Special Forces base. Now, I don't know about you, Brian, but I wasn't aware that the British government had officially acknowledged the existence of British bases in Syria. So that's possibly a new one there. They said that this was on the Jordanian-Iraqi border, and what that reminded me was if you think back a couple of years ago, we were talking about a big build-up on the Jordanian side of the Syrian border involving UK and US troops. And clearly that is this is one of the results of that. But the other thing that they mentioned here was the fact that they had damaged a £44 million Hercules aircraft during a heavy landing during a covert mission. So clearly Special Air Forces and other British military directly involved on the ground. And I'm not certain that there is actually a parliamentary mandate for that.
It's a really good question. If we go back, we can remember that David Cameron said that we would not be putting boots on the ground in Syria. We found out probably about 2 years ago that there were British boots on the ground. That was special forces operating in Syria. Now we're seeing that this is a bit more of a permanent situation. So we've obviously got a proper base set up. None of it debated in Westminster, none of it communicated to the British public. So who are the people that authorise this? Who in government actually makes the decision that effectively a private army is going to be sent overseas to operate in Syria? Is this done with the Defence Select Committee? That's possible. But also, is it the Pearl office inside the cabinet, this very secretive government office that is now making the decision on everything? So we've said before, backbenchers don't get a chance to be involved in government. If you're not in the cabinet, you're not one of the players. But even if you're in the cabinet, we've now got another layer of secrecy with this Pearl office, which we know is heavily connected to the banking fraternity. So who's calling the shots on Britain's special forces? Is it the government, or is it, well, who knows?
But there's no oversight, no
oversight at all. Well, if we're managing to bomb in Syria, we've got a few problems still with the F-35. I couldn't resist using the Russian report on this because it's the most comprehensive report. But here's the F-35. Senators dismayed as new report reveals Pentagon overestimated F-35 savings by 600 million. So this is a loss-making program itself, which has accrued loss after loss after loss. Now we've overestimated the savings. So this is what it's about, that apparently Congress being told that if they spent another $661 million, that would enable them to save 1.2 billion over the life of the project with regard to spares and all sorts of other stuff. But when those figures were checked, the reality was that it would only save 600 million, which according to my maths would mean another 61 million loss. So it's not going well. I'll say that I did notice in, I think it was Friday's Plymouth Herald, a minute paragraph which said that Britain's 2 operational F-35s did a test flight from their base in UK. So they've moved from America to the UK, but they've now actually taken to the skies. We have a whole vast aircraft carrier waiting with no aircraft, but apparently 2 have taken to the skies. And that was in about I'm sorry to use the expression, a 2 centimetre square, 1 inch square paragraph in the Herald. And what's been happening with regard to problems on the F-35, well, this is just some of it. Last month, the Government Accountability Office, obviously in the States, recommended that Congress withhold funding from the programme until it fixes its 996 deficiencies, of which over 100 were considered to be severe enough to pose a threat to user safety and security. Flaws include faulty oxygen supply systems. We've been talking about this for months, Mike. We've built an aircraft, but we can't actually supply the pilot with oxygen. Injury-causing ejector seat, as well as an unusable helmet-mounted display system. It's interesting that those 3 items would surely be enough to stop people wanting to fly them.
Yes.
We'll leave that there. But clearly the F-35 is not doing well at the moment.
No.
And perhaps I can also add to that, of course, if this was a British built aircraft, the BBC would absolutely be hammering the manufacturers and everything about the aircraft, including the government's expenditure on it. But because it's an American aircraft, we largely have silence from the BBC.
Okay, now the Russians have they've kicked off the International Army Games this week. Their first preliminaries kicked off in Southern Military District, and the commander for the Southern Military District assigned a mission to organise competitions in order to identify which were the best crews and units. There are quite a number of people taking part in this. 26 contests, including a tank biathlon, various other things as well. But the key point is here that there's some new participants. So let's see, what have we got? Sergei Shoigu had this to say: this year the International Army Games will bring together 181 teams from 32 countries, nearly a third more than last year. He said that it's a pleasure to see that the scope of the competitions expand geographically and the list of participants to grow. So military service people from Algeria, Vietnam, Myanmar, Pakistan, Sudan and the Philippines have joined this. This is one of these unbelievably aggressive Russian exercises that NATO complains about constantly, and this is why NATO is running ever larger exercises in the Baltics in particular. Nonetheless, the Russians stepping up their efforts to bring other countries in as well. And what are we starting to see? The world divide into two main teams? Is that what seems to be going on?
Well, that's absolutely what's happened, Mike. And of course, this has been absolutely created by the West with the leadership of the UK and the United States. There can be no doubt about this, as the series of troop movements and exercises has come from the West and come from NATO. So it's obvious.
Now, of course, the NATO summit is next week, and President Trump is going to be at that, and they're all extremely concerned about what he's going to say. We'll come on to that in a second. But here's one example of anti-Trump hysteria. This is the Atlantic Council. The headline is "Trump sends threatening letter to Norway and tells Trudeau that Canada is undermining NATO." Now, this headline, this alleged threat, is citing this article in Norwegian news: "Trump sends NATO threat to Solberg." In fact, what he did was he sent a letter, and it actually wasn't a threatening letter at all. It's on screen at the moment if you want to freeze the screen later on and read the full text. But he basically saying, well, he appreciates the efforts that the Norwegians have made to put more funding into, well, I can actually blow it up there for people, into their defence. And really it's not enough, because they need to do more. He said, "I understand domestic political pressures, as I myself have expended considerable political capital to increase our own defence spending. It will, however, become increasingly difficult to justify American citizens why some countries continue to fail to meet our shared collective security commitments." I don't see any threat in this whatsoever. It's quite a reasonable letter under the circumstances. But the hysteria continues to build, and let's continue with it. This is CNN, and this is Fareed Zakaria, who went to London last week, came to London to get some idea of what the British thought about the Trump-Putin summit, and spoke to George Osborne, spoke to Alistair Campbell, who of course was Tony Blair's spin doctor. And Osborne said, "It makes the US a less reliable partner for Western countries like my own. Trump's unprecedented approach to Russia has stirred discord amongst European leaders who want to isolate Putin." And what did Campbell have to say? He said, "There are new rising powers like, of course, China and a more resurgent Russia. The one thing I'd say is Trump is not doing anything to counter those forces. He's accelerating them." So they're expressing real concern about what Trump is in the process of doing, and I don't think I've seen this type of response from the British leadership, past and present, for any other situation.
Well, because he's not playing for whatever reason, Mike, Trump is not playing the British game at the moment. The British game is to ramp up tension and clearly to try and provoke Russia. I don't think there's any doubt about that. Well, for Trump to go and have talks and is basically conducting diplomacy in a reasonable way, this is a threat to the warmongers, isn't it?
Absolutely. Well, the Russians aren't going to be provoked in any way. This is Dmitry Peskov, who's the spokesperson for Vladimir Putin. He said, no doubt Moscow and Washington have many issues where their positions are diametrically opposed. But you see now that political resolve has prevailed, and at the moment understanding is growing that such issues for discussion should not be an obstacle on the path of establishing and expanding bilateral dialogue, in this case at the top level. And he said the Russian president has stated many times and explained in his interlocutors that such an issue as Crimea cannot be and never will be on the agenda, as Crimea is an inalienable part of Russia. All other issues are a matter of consensus for discussion and a search for possible common ground. And he said that Russia is open for dialogue and jointly searching for compromises. Let us not rush to speak about thaws. Both sides need to discuss and review the differences and sources of major concern in bilateral relations. But the point is, they are absolutely open to doing that, they're not going to fall for the attempts to split people up.
Yeah. Okay, let's jump to our promised update on Melanie Shaw, and this is really the latest. Melanie Shaw, the Beechwood child abuse survivor, is due to appear in Leeds Crown Court on the 10th of July. She's going to face arson and sexual assault charges, and these alleged offences were, of course, carried out in prison. Now, having said that, there's been huge confusion about what has been happening to Melanie. This is not unusual because it was happening at the very start of Melanie's trials and tribulations before she went into prison for the very first time, and has continued all the way through. But on yesterday, so 2nd of July, let's have a little look at what we can report on that. So this was a hearing which was not posted publicly until a few days before. Now, that can be normal, sometimes it's not, but the pattern with Melanie Shaw is usually postings publicly of her hearings have occurred very late, if at all. But what do we know? Well, the court hearing was a mentions hearing, and the UK column was accurate in reporting that as a mention hearing. Some people saw a report that it was a non-compliance hearing of a community order. That was never the case. It was to be a mentions hearing, and that was actually what took place. Now, we understand that Melanie did not appear in court, nor did she appear by video link. And this is normal for the cases with Melanie, that she has certainly not been appearing in court. And of course, where she has had the advantage of a video link, that has often broken down as Melanie has started to stand up and give her own defence. So we would say to our audience today, if you want to understand the dangers of the wider upgrade of the court system, which Mike has been talking about in many UK column news editions, we're now really starting to see it, because where the state has got a vendetta against the accused, they can simply make sure that you can never get your evidence into court because they cut the video link. Now, her solicitor did not appear in court, and a barrister was used to represent Melanie without her instruction. Now, this is where things get subtle, because I have to say at the moment, I'm not able to release all the information that I have. That is for Melanie's protection. But the fact that her solicitor did not appear in court, there's not necessarily anything to read into that. However, that a barrister was used to represent her without her instruction, we find very strange. That is as much as I can give on that. We may be able to report more in the coming days. So Melanie is currently on remand in HMP style. Remember that this lady has now served over 2 years in prison, and at least 18 months of that time, possibly nearer 19 months, she spent in solitary confinement. And remember that Melanie is a child abuse survivor. She does suffer with trauma and solitary confinement must have been one of the most vicious environments to put her in that we can imagine. Whether this will be taken into account in the charges, we don't know. She's allegedly facing 4 arson charges and 1 of sexual assault. What I can say is that at the time these charges were created, Melanie was able to say to some of the people in communication with her that she was facing extreme bullying inside the prison. She was fearful for her safety, and she frequently talked about being put in a situation where she felt she was at risk of assault certainly by I'll say overzealous warders, but also by some of the other inmates. And the cases date from 2017 and also 2018, but we understand that some of the original 2017 charges have been dropped. So how can we sum this up? Well, we can best sum it up by saying that it is remarkable that in Theresa May's Conservative Britain in 2018, an extremely vulnerable child abuse survivor is not only kept in solitary confinement and brutalised in a series of British prisons, but when her case goes to court, we suddenly end up in a black hole where the video links don't work or the public notices are not posted on time. Well, is there a reason for this? We think there is, but let's have a look at some of the evidence that other people saw. This is a report that several picked up where the day was listed as a non-compliance hearing. So where this came from, we don't know, because it was clear via the legal teams that this was to be a mentions hearing. And a mentions hearing, if you don't know, is simply a discussion on the procedural aspects of the case. Why was it reported as non-compliance? We don't know. Now, let's bring in the Independent Child Sexual Abuse Inquiry, because I have personally been in correspondence with them about Melanie Shaw, and this was a response that I received. It says, "Dear Mr. Gerrish, thank you for contacting the inquiry via our information line on the 13th of June. I believe that in your call you asked what the inquiry will do to obtain evidence of abuse of Beechwood Children's Home from a specific individual who is currently held in prison." Well, of course, there was no specific individual. The lady I was referring to and referred to in detail was Melanie Shaw, and I was very confident in doing that because, as we will see, Melanie Shaw has consistently tried to give evidence to the child abuse inquiry. They went on, "I am afraid that unless we have the consent of that individual, we're unable to contact that individual directly, nor discuss that individual's alleged experience with anyone else. This is to ensure her confidentiality and right to privacy are preserved. If this individual chooses to contact us directly, then we will be happy to engage with her." But the whole point of my call was to report that, of course, Melanie did not have normal communications and therefore had been unable to make contact with the inquiry. Hence, I alerted the inquiry and suggested that they actually spoke to her directly. However, we now see that they are not prepared to go into prison to talk to many of the abuse survivors who are currently in prison. The inquiry's terms of reference, which are available on our website here, state that we will pass all allegations of child abuse to the police. Having reviewed a record of your call to the inquiry, it appears that the information you gave about child abuse at Beechwood Children's Home is already known to the police, and your call contained no new allegations. As such, we will not be passing this information or your contact details to the police." This is remarkable, Mike, because of course one of the points I made is that when Melanie attempted to give information, she was bullied and harassed by the police and subsequently has been put out of commission in prison. So my warning was that the inquiry needed to speak to this lady in order to see through the wall of silence which has occurred with the help of Nottinghamshire Police. But it gets more interesting. Let's move on to this one. Just need to catch up with myself on the other screen. Here we are. So this is an email which has been sent to another ICSA lady, Elizabeth Long. I'll read it very quickly. Attached is a letter you have sent to and been forwarded on to me by a colleague. I am the lay advocate of the lady in question, and I do have lawful authority to act for her and have endeavoured to have her rights upheld and her wishes, which are publicly known about from her approaches herself and on her Facebook page, requesting full participation in this inquiry. I have been contacting the inquiry since October 2016 on her behalf, as she is unlawfully detained against her will, and seems there are thousands of prisoners who are being denied across this inquiry. Have been denied access to this inquiry, who have had lives of hell due to institutionalised child sexual abuse in the care system in UK. I have been told you're going to have a prison line to enable those detained access to this inquiry. So when do you intend for this to happen, as thousands detained are being positively denied the right to participate and engage in this inquiry? On her behalf, I was due to be visited by an ICSA individual, an inquiry manager from Exeter last August, and I am still waiting. Likewise, my calls to you from October 2016 and August 2017, when I request copies of them under GDPR A15, seem to have disappeared. When are you going to do as you claim and allow the real victims of CSA access to this inquiry so their voices are heard and form part of it? You do have the consent of this lady who requires access to this inquiry. If it continues to be denied, her situation will be made public of your denial to allow her participation and the bringing of this inquiry into total disrepute. I look forward to hearing from you. I myself contacted the inquiry 11, 13 and 18 of June 2018, and once again still no courtesy of the promised return call or response. Why is this? So, Mike, it's becoming very, very obvious that the child abuse inquiry does not want to speak to Melanie Shaw. We say that this is because of the very detailed information that Melanie Shaw holds. And of course, Melanie showed very early on that Nottinghamshire police were not investigating the Beechwood case properly. Well, here is the evidence that Melanie herself was very keen to speak to the inquiry. So part of Facebook posting, and it says here, I'm coming to see you, Dame Goddard. My MP, the ex-Shadow Chancellor's Chris Leslie, contacted you for me, and PCC Paddy Tipping also did on my behalf and request, and you can't be bothered to get back to me. Same message, Mike, isn't it? Same message. I'll come to you then. Your expenses pay my hotel and travelling to London and meals, though if I'm coming to you for constructive talks. Look forward to seeing you. So Melanie herself declared publicly that she needed to speak to the inquiry, but the inquiry tells the people that are saying to the inquiry, you need to speak to this woman. The inquiry simply says, go away. Well, we have a little bit more, but we keep it very short here because this is part of a communication with the inquiry about missing information. And if I go down to the last paragraph here, it says, I have been advised that you said you made contact with the inquiry last year. However, there's no record in any of our systems of this call. Now, I'm summarising that considerably, Mike, because viewers can freeze that screen. But once again, we're into missing data. We don't know who called. We don't know what happened to the phone records. I think we've seen all this before. And I'm not alone in warning about what's happening with this lady. And I just wanted to say thank you very much to the person, sorry, that should be about, beg your pardon, small typo there. The lady who produced this leaflet, which was sent to us, we received it this morning. If you freeze it on screen, you can read it, but somebody has taken the time and effort here to try and put together a short, concise summary of what's happened to Melanie Shaw. We will continue to report, but I think we have to say the evidence is growing that the independent child abuse inquiry in England and Wales at least is disingenuous, a sham. We're not too sure between those two, but we're going to continue to expose what's happening.
And of course, while Melanie's stuck in prison, it's very, very difficult for her to pursue her rights.
Well, they've got her completely pinned down, Mike. So she goes through the abuse. You set up a national inquiry to talk to abuse survivors, and then you make sure that Melanie Shaw can't speak out. And why do we think that is? Because Melanie Shaw's information not only includes abuse of children at Beechwood, but also in a wider capacity, and again brings in the British political establishment.
Okay, let's get back to Treason May and her statement to the House of Commons yesterday, because she was talking about Brexit, and she was extremely excited about it. She said, turning to Brexit, Mr. Speaker, I updated my fellow leaders at the European Council meeting last week on the negotiations, and the 27 other member states welcomed the further progress that had been made on the withdrawal agreement. With the exception of the protocol relating to Northern Ireland, we now have agreement or are close to doing so. There remain some real differences between us and the European Commission on Northern Ireland. So, Mr. Speaker, on the protocol on Northern Ireland, I want to be very clear. We have put forward proposals and will produce further proposals so that if a temporary backstop is needed, there will be no hard border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. Fantastic stuff. She said they're absolutely committed, or perhaps they should be, to the avoidance of such a border. She said, I will hold a meeting of the Cabinet at Chequers on Friday, and we'll publish our white paper on the future partnership with the EU next week. So that's what we're looking forward to, this white paper, which comes out next week. And I will be very surprised if there are many significant differences to the white paper that David Cameron published in 2015, but we wait with interest to see how what this looks like.
I don't think I want to take a bet on that.
No, I'm not going to take a bet on it. No, I'm not going to take a bet on it, but be surprised nonetheless. And then one of the other things that she was discussing about was migrants, and of course, a very large part of what the European Council was discussing at the end of last week was the migrant crisis. Angela Merkel. After the main EU summit last week and a mini summit on refugees, told us all that all 27 member nations had compromised over the issue of migration and migrants, and that she had reached what she described as bilateral agreements with 14 member states to return refugees to the country in which they first arrived. Now, the EU rules say that when a migrant comes into the EU, they should be settled in the country they first arrive in, whereas that's not happening at the moment. The 14 countries that apparently they set up bilateral agreements with were Hungary, Poland, included Hungary, Poland, and the Czech Republic. But unfortunately, Hungary, Poland, and the Czech Republic have said this is a load of nonsense, that there's no such deal. So it's already starting to fall apart. Theresa May, however, went further in her briefing yesterday. She said that they're going to provide more opportunities for the countries where economic migrants are coming from, and they've made a further commitment to the Council, the European Council, of 15 million euros to support the EU Trust Fund for Africa. That's going to make a lot of difference, isn't it? It's
Brexit without the exit, Mike, is the name of the game.
There's certainly not much is going to be done with 15 million euros. But anyway, so what was agreed? Well, member states have agreed to send migrants who arrive in EU territory to control centres across the bloc. Now, isn't that one of the problems that Donald Trump was getting such criticism over the last few weeks? But apparently the EU is going to do the same things. Locations of those control centres still to be decided, but they'll only appear in countries that volunteer to have them. These control centres are going to provide rapid and secure processing to separate out economic migrants from refugees with a potential right to asylum, for whom the principle of solidarity would apply, they said. and they said that they were going to tighten the EU's external border as well. And they're going to put processing centres in countries such as Algeria, Egypt, Libya, Morocco, Niger and Tunisia. Now, slight problem there because Algeria, Egypt, Libya, Morocco, Niger and Tunisia haven't actually agreed to these processing centres, but that's been announced anyway, so we don't need to worry about that. And then Merkel having announced that, well, she was about to lose her government once again because the Horst Seehofer, the CSU leader, one of the coalition partners, really was pretty unhappy with this deal. But apparently she's done a deal with him and just about by the skin of her nose held on for another few weeks. But this issue is becoming a major issue for EU countries and for EU governments now. And, you know, we had more elections in northern Italy yesterday, local elections in northern Italy last week, and well, again, the League has been extremely successful, toppling political parties that have held power in Italy for decades. So starting to see more and more rejection of this type of rhetoric from politicians and these types of actions from politicians right across the European Union. And that's why they are so concerned about this issue at the moment, because it's actually an existential threat for the European Union itself.
Cracks are appearing.
Absolutely.
Cracks are appearing, which we welcome. Okay, well, we'll return to home, UK and court system. And I'd just like to say I was sent this fantastic email and accompanying letter this morning. And for me, this is exactly what people should be doing, which is getting in amongst it, but in a very polite, measured way. Very powerful letter, as we're going to see. So this was sent to me by a lady called Samantha Wakefield. So it's an email to the Lord Chancellor and several other people. Dear all, there's been a lot of questioning regarding the internal workings of the family courts. Please see the attached letter to the Lord Chancellor and President of the Family Court Division. I'm a concerned member of the public who has witnessed many wrongdoings to people by judges, and after researching the subject feel it's time to hold the judges accountable for their actions. Well, we'd certainly agree with that. So this is the letter. We'll do this very quickly. Dear Lord Chancellor and President of the Family Division, I'm writing to you as a concerned member of the public. I would like to make reference to a review of practice in the family law courts made by Justice Cobb. The document is called 12J FPR 2010. It states that judges need retraining on recognising coercive behaviour by ex-partners in child custody battles. It is acknowledged that abusive and manipulative ex-partners can continue to abuse their ex-partner using coercive behaviour within the family court system. As I'm sure you're aware, coercion is now a very serious crime. What I am asking from you, I would like to see a list of all the judges that have been retrained under this review of practice and the courts they operate from. The name and details of the training programme being used, a copy of the syllabus of the training course provided. Is the respondent permitted to ask the judge for their proof of completing the training programme before a hearing? If the judge has not been retrained, can they be asked not to sit on the case and be replaced with one that's completed the training? There is one judge that is very questionable that's only been in the position for 2 months, and I would wonder if you could find out if she has completed this training. Her name is Penny Ireland and she works in Exeter. I look forward to hearing from you with the information requested no later really than 20 days from the date of receiving this request. So a freedom of information request, really challenging the judges by their own petard, if I can use that slightly twisted expression, because they set the rules. They said that judges clearly needed retraining. So this lady is now in there saying, well, how many of you have been retrained? Will be fascinating to see the answer. But as always, I did a little bit of research to remind myself of the Lord Chancellor, and here he is, David Gauck. And very interesting Twitter page, because he's saying he's retweeting from Luke Robinson. Yesterday, our fantastic legal service, our great campaign. Legal Service Are Great campaign hosted over 150 guests from across the sector with excellent speeches from David Golk and others. We're looking forward to working with business to promote the sector throughout 2018. So this is not about law and order and justice, Mike. This is about profit making from the legal business. And we've got the Lord Chancellor right in the middle of it. But it got better because this is another tweet that he retweeted from the Law Society. We're proud to support Ministry of Justice, Government UK, Legal Services. We've got the S on it, which is nice to see. Legal Services Are Great campaign. Joe Egan joined Lord Chancellor David Galt yesterday at the Lancaster House launch. So there's the great and good in their gilded palaces. But of course, the reality is very different. And I just had to flag up this very tragic story where this young lady experienced a decision in the family court and then died very soon afterwards. And whilst there was clearly some unfortunate handling of the case by the medical teams, the paramedics who turned up, knowing how vicious family court hearings can be, many people, of course, are saying that this lady really died of a broken heart, but we don't know what the ruling was. But I think that does show the status of Britain's family courts.
Okay, we'll end with this one then. This is CNBC in the United States. Companies buying back their own shares is the only thing keeping the stock market afloat. They're saying stocks right now are hanging by a thread, boosted by a bonanza of corporate buying unrivaled in market history and held back by a burst in investor selling that also has set a new record. So this is a pretty spectacular situation. They're saying corporate cash is going to find a home, and it's either going to be in buybacks, dividends, or mergers and acquisitions activity. Where it's not going to be is capital investment. Individuals are looking at the turbulence we've seen this year and we had not seen last year. That creates its own sort of exit sign for investors who don't want to deal with that. So normal investors not investing, companies buying back their shares at an incredible rate. Well, I just wanted to highlight this graph, which Zero Hedge was pushing out today, because it shows the the S&P 500, one of the stock indexes in the United States. And you can see quite clearly the rise and fall at the turn of the century, and then again in 2007, 2008, and the rise and rise ever since on the back of nothing, actually, really. So Zero Hedge saying the next bubble blown by the Fed after this one bursts, well, will be something else.
It's going to be big.
It's going to be big. So the point that CNBC making is that a lot of what's driving this is not investor money. It is companies buying back shares, and when they stop doing that, I mean, they have huge quantities of cash on hand. They're not investing it. Instead, they're using it to buy back stocks. But when that money disappears, that's really the last thing that's holding this lot up.
Okay, right, that brings us to the end of the news today. Thank you to everyone who's given support for Melanie Shaw. And I'm going to say Melanie Shaw is in a very, very dangerous position at the moment because, of course, those offences, or the alleged offences, have taken place in prison. Were there witnesses? Are those witnesses independent, or are they hostile to Melanie herself? We have no way of knowing. And will Melanie be excluded from court for the actual trial? That is a possibility. It will only be immense public interest that keeps this lady safe. And if we get to get the truth out about the abuse of children by senior British political figures and members of the establishment, she is one of the key people to support. Having said that, we recognise, of course, many, many good people, child abuse survivors, fighting to get the truth out via other means, and we will do our best to report and support them as well. But we have known Melanie for a long time now, so we're going to stick with her. That's it for today. We'll be back at the same time tomorrow. Thank you for joining us. Bye-bye.